Okay, so what's fun about this particular session is that there's absolutely no way I'm going to be able to get a perfect value proposition defined for any company. And the reason that it's important to spend some time on it, despite giving you that upfront warning, is that most of the time people actually don't spend enough time on the value proposition early, and they tend to take a lot of it for granted. They just assume that they've got a great idea, that that's going to be the basis for a great business. But it turns out that even before you have the great idea, there's a whole bunch of thinking that you can do that will help you set yourself up for success. So that's what this session's about. It's about where do you start and how do you get from what might be a potentially explosive idea that you've got or business potential and put it down in a value proposition that will get you going towards building a business. So without that background, it would be hard to introduce my guest, but we have a wonderful story to tell tonight, and that is of a company that's become the fastest growing storage software company ever. So you're going to hear that story tonight, but you're also going to hear the story that behind the scenes was going on, which was that when this first was explained to us, it was incredibly hard for my partners to understand. I happen to have been working with the entrepreneur, actually both of the founders, during the early stages of things, so it was sort of being filtered into me day by day. But the story was actually quite hard to tell in the early days, and the value proposition wasn't necessarily brain dead obvious. Yet, as you've just heard, it's become an incredibly successful company. So we're going to try to reveal to you, with the real case study here, how that happened and how it's come to play. And I, at this point, would like to welcome Mike Troiano. Mike, if you'd like to just stand up, introduce yourself, who's going to be here to start off with. So Mike is our CMO at Actifio. And he's going to be joined later on by Ashutosh, who's the founder, who, in true style of a good founder, is on closing calls because they moved the quarter by a month. So it turns out that he's in a very busy set of negotiations at the moment. But anyway, he'll be joining us a little bit later on. Good. Let's be clear, he's a marketing guy because he's getting his handle up there. Great. Good to have you here, Mike. Okay, let's start with the agenda for tonight. So there are three key parts to this. The definition of your value proposition, how you evaluate it, and then we're going to get to what you want to build. Now, each of these has their own particular reason for being. So the definition is the place where you could get hung up, but most people miss the second step, and that's evaluating it. And I want you to take away tonight at least a sense of how you can self-evaluate before you even get out into testing this with customers and validating in the marketplace, which of course is critical. And then, obviously, I think what you'll do is be able to build a value proposition that, for the purposes of getting your business started, should give you the kind of velocity that we're looking to get you some unfair competitive advantage from. Now, in order to get you thinking about this in the right way, I'm going to tell you where we want to end up. So that might sound like, okay, we're starting at the end, but I want you to know where we're headed. So where we're headed is as follows. We want to be able to get to a statement that looks something like this. For the target customers that you're going after, you should be able to spell out what they are dissatisfied with and what the current alternatives are, and give a very specific description of what the product or service is that you're introducing and why it's new and different, and then provide the key statement about what problem it solves, and then at the end, make it clear why it's unlike other alternatives and approaches. So this is where we're going to head to. And literally, even though it's only on one page here and it's one slide, it is one of the most fundamental building blocks of starting your business. And we're going to take tonight the time to pull this apart and make sure that each part of it becomes obvious to you. So how might you start? Well, first of all, the typical thing that we see entrepreneurs do is to start with an idea. And the problem with ideas is they're free-floating. They don't have a concept of what particular space are they addressing, or they don't necessarily have a target audience. And if you've just got an idea, for example, to introduce a new product or service and you don't know who you're targeting at, it becomes very difficult for people to glom onto it and figure out what you're going to do to develop it. So what we try to do in this session is get you to think about things a little differently. And there are really two models for this, and I'm going to use Actifio right away to jump in. You can think about a technology, for example, or a breakthrough, and you could try to bring it to a problem. Or you can think about a problem and how to go build the technology or solution for it. So why don't you jump in, Mike, and tell us, how did Actifio approach this? And without telling the entire story, give us a sense of what was difficult for you about this.
I think what makes Ash unique is that he is he's really someone who developed intimate familiarity with a business problem. That was the way enterprises store and manage their data. And Ash built a company a while ago called AppIQ. He started off as an engineer, actually. He built, like, all the way down to the metal, built software and applications that were behind some very important storage products, and then left to start a company called AppIQ, and eventually sold that to HP and became the head of the storage division at HP, which used to be a very important company. That was a joke. And so what's interesting about Ash is that he really developed a very intimate familiarity with a business problem, that being how enterprises store and manage their data. And he's really built a career kind of applying successive generations of technology against that problem. And that is, I would say, it's a sweeping generalization. I'd be curious to get your thoughts on this, Mike. But that is a more typical on the West Coast than I think here.
Yeah.
Here, very often you have, some, smart kid at, here or across the river, and they have a great idea, and they're going to go find a problem to solve. And that's sort of an archetypal, entrepreneur mode here. On the West Coast, it's more, somebody did their time at PayPal or whatever, and they have become intimately familiar with a customer's business problem, and they're going to, looking back from that, apply some new generation of technology against it. And I think that is where we started, and frankly, I think that's a great place to start. Many of you have started already, but anyway, the Actifio story really starts with that. Intimate familiarity with a scaled enterprise problem related to data management and maybe the ability to apply some new technology in solving that problem.
Great. So thank you, Mike. Now, who's got an idea in the room? What's your idea? Yeah.
Okay, so do you want me to give you my pitch?
No, just give me your idea.
It's a healthcare navigation and healthcare advocacy consultancy.
Okay, so healthcare navigation, healthcare advocation, consultancy.
Yes.
Okay. So what's interesting about that idea is there's lots of different directions you could take it. I'm already hearing, many different ways. So let's think about what the challenge is with this. How do we go about taking that idea and turning it into something that everybody can relate to immediately? Does anybody have a basis for a healthcare problem that they're navigating? Go ahead.
I have a son with autism, and trying to navigate the process of getting a diagnosis for him that included all of his challenges was a nightmare. I could have used a healthcare navigator for that.
Awesome. Okay, so you two are going to meet at the break.
She's my ideal partner.
Okay, so what's great about this is real time, you can hear the difference between having an idea and having a problem, and a really significant problem. A member of your family has autism and you're trying to find the right healthcare. That's a big deal. Which would you rather start with? Would you rather start with a story of somebody who's got an autistic patient, or would you rather start with this generalized idea? Pretty obvious. The story is much easier when you can start with a problem and take that problem and say, because I have this need, and it's really significant, I need to find somebody who can navigate the healthcare system. So it's ideal that the two of you had that. So this is why, in a nutshell, I encourage you to start with the problem and very specifically focus in on that. We know that people are spending a lot of money storing data in the enterprise. Everybody knows that that need is growing. And literally, all we could really tell from what Ash's initial thinking was that that was something that was being done in an ineffective, inefficient way by a lot of different players. And Ash had an idea, and that's the only way I could characterize it, how he would harmonize all of that. In other words, he would unify data and create a service that would somehow make it much more efficient. It was literally that basic. I'm not kidding. And there's a lot to what Mike said, which is that if you're Ash and you've got a track record and you've been CTO of HP and you've done AppIQ, you probably have a lot more credibility. But you in the audience, in many instances, will be first-time entrepreneurs, because I know a number of you. And so you won't have that credibility. So you won't get that grace, if you will. You're going to have to figure out how you're going to define this problem a lot better. So hopefully, if I've done nothing else at this point, I've convinced you that an idea is great, but we really want you to get to what I would call an absolutely burning need, something that is so painful that somebody is saying, without the solution to this problem, it's a matter of life or death, which obviously if you've got, something like we've already had the very personal case study of, a member of your family who's got autism and you want to actually go and find care for it, that's an example of something that's a really burning need. But there can be many other examples. It could be as basic as, for example, in the storage world, we literally can't restore our data from the various different places we're backing up fast enough when we have disasters. And so that's causing us to lose customers. It's causing us, for example, to be unable to respond to our business needs. But whatever it is, and whatever scenario it is, whether it's B2B or it's healthcare or it's consumer, the problem is the thing we want to get out early. So what's the way to bring your problem out? I have 4 U's that I want you to be able to remember after tonight. Unworkable, unavoidable, urgent, and underserved. Really great problems worth solving are usually for you. So those of you who know me know that I like acronyms because I was a horrible student myself. And the way that I learned anything was by putting acronyms together. So 4U is all you have to remember tonight. Now let's dig into these for a second and talk about what is an example of each one of these. So unworkable. A broken business process is something that's unworkable. This is an example where if you can find something that is so broken that if it doesn't get fixed, people lose money, or they spend more than they need to, or worst case, and this is ideally, somebody gets fired, you found a good, unworkable, broken business problem. Now, why do I say somebody gets fired? What's the relevance of that? Anybody tell me what might be important about that?
Maybe using the former example about the fashion piece.
Yep.
And to maybe materialize it, I see a lack of functionality in inventory management programs. They're just poorly designed.
Yep.
For apparel specifically.
Yep.
And so somebody who has a lot of experience with those programs would be very useful if you're going to create a program that's going to be better.
Okay.
You'd want somebody that was working directly with it, functionally. I don't know if does that get at your...
It's getting at it, so I'm going to try to help you along. So Charles, you may see this differently since it was your example, but let's just extrapolate a little bit. If we said that there was an inventory control problem such that somebody was going to get fired because we either had too much inventory, in which case we were wasting money at the end of the season, we were throwing out garments and we basically never sold. That would be one example. The other extreme, what if we literally couldn't fulfill customer demand for a particular item and we were losing revenue because somebody kept coming in and asking for this particular, whatever it is, blouse or sweater or something, and we just couldn't fulfill it. We just had never managed to track the demand. That's an example of a broken business problem. But what I was trying to get to is the following, is if I know somebody's accountable for that and they'll get fired because we lose the revenue or we have too much cost on the books that we write off at the end of the year, I have a champion. And I have somebody at that point who I can actually get to who is literally going to want to solve this problem to save their job. That's what I mean by a broken mission critical problem. And if you can identify the person that owns it who would lose their job if it's not solved, you've already got yourself a resource as a startup that's going to be extremely valuable to you. And if they can explain to you in specific terms why, like for example, they can't keep up with the number of products that they have in the current system they have because it's manual in some way or there's some broken link, you know you're onto something. And the more dire the consequences, the better your potential solution. So I love problems that have huge and dire consequences, and I would look for those if I were you. Now you might be saying to me, well, how do I think of that in a not-for-profit world? Well, Alok can tell you, if you want to look at his case study, that even in the not-for-profit world, there are dire consequences, obviously, if you can't get things like medicines to the right people in the right place at the right time. And it's also true in the B2C world even. There are lots of examples of that. Like, obviously, if you find yourself going on a date and you can never get to the right place at the right time and you miss your date, that has dire consequences too. So, whether it's mapping or it's social networking or it's connections, they're all different and they all have their own different particular example. But that's what I'm looking for, is unworkable problems. That is the start of the first U. Okay, unavoidable. Who's been dealing with their taxes this week? Okay, a few of you at least. Taxes are unavoidable. The fact is, death and taxes are the two things we have to look forward to in life. These are part of our world, right? So whether we like it or not, there is regulation that requires us to file taxes. So guess what? If you're part of solving a problem that is unavoidable, you're already in the money, because you're not going to have to ask somebody whether they need it. You know they need it. You know that they're going to have to file their taxes. Well, it turns out there are a lot of problems that actually are unavoidable. I'm going to give you an example from our own portfolio. It turns out right now the cause of the financial crisis is pretty well understood as derivative accounting. The financial instruments got so complicated that nobody could actually understand them, let alone account for them. And so big companies like GE were waking up one day and finding out that they had done currency hedging or other kinds of arbitrage that literally were unaccounted for. And when they got accounted for, they caused them to lose hundreds of millions of dollars off their share price because it turned out that they hadn't been well managed. So people immediately regulated for that and said, okay, we now have to account for derivatives. And a company was born out of that called Reval. It's a company that's now doing extremely well. It's just gone on file to go public, so I can't talk too much about it. But they're solving what became an unavoidable problem, i.e. derivatives need to be accounted for, and that's now law. So those are the kinds of problems I'm going to try to get you to think about. It may not be anything to do with law, or it may not be anything to do with regulation. The world around us has many needs that are ultimately unavoidable if you look at them in the right way. But even that isn't good enough, because everybody's attention is constantly being competed for. And so the next U is urgent. Let me give you an example that will help set up the Actifio story. In the enterprise world, almost every company has a budget defined well in advance of spending money. And in that budget, there'll be huge, clear priorities that are identified probably from line of business people driving IT to do something like, for example, meet some new imperative that the company's defined. A good example might be, as the mobile world is sort of taken off, you know, a bank might say, it's absolutely imperative that we have mobile solutions that can touch our customers anywhere they are, where they can bank with us 24/7. That might be an imperative. And it becomes urgent to meet all of the different pieces of the mobile solution that's going to be delivered and rolled out. Well, you might say, okay, we want to introduce a new accounting initiative, something that will actually help you with your accounting. Even though we've already identified accounting as something that's unavoidable, it may not be urgent at that point. It may be that they're actually much more interested in getting to customers in this new mobile world. And so they're going to deprioritize this accounting initiative that you walk in with, and they're going to reprioritize everything that's mobile. You've got to figure out where you fit in the pecking order. And the bottom line is, if you're not in the top 3, you're probably not going to get any attention. And you've got to understand how to align to those priorities. You've got to understand where will you fall in their, if you like, ordering of the things that they're going to spend time and money on. Now, one of the things that's important to me is to think about what might get moved up or down and why. Good entrepreneurs do the following. They look at the market conditions around them and they say, something's changing. And they identify those changes that cause things to become urgent. So I just gave you an example of it. We all have got used to the world from a mobile phone. We've got used to the idea that from a mobile device, we can do everything. And so it's actually changing the way we access things like our bank, or for that matter, the web in general. And so guess what? It's becoming urgent for almost any organization that touches consumers to do so through at least the mobile channel, if not other multiple channels. You know, whether it's, for example, in e-commerce world, it's things like in-store or, you know, pop-up stores, etc. But my point is that you can see the world around us is changing to a much more mobile world where everybody wants to be able to access things anywhere, anytime, 24/7. So that trend is massive. How might that serve your definition of your problem? How might it actually drive urgency? And if you can align with something that's causing that change, then that'll help you, for example, get prioritized. Whereas if you just come in, as I said, and raw spell out your technology, it's going to be difficult for people to relate to why is it urgent. Let's get on to the last U to give you a sense of this. In business, this last one is extremely important, which is underserved. Because in many instances, I've already talked to you about the idea of a budget. There is a zero-sum game going on here. So those of you who were at last week's workshop, I talked to you about competition. And I said, every startup has competition. And some people looked at me blankly. And I said, the reason is because ultimately there's only a certain amount of money that's going to get spent in a business setting, for example. And so you're always competing for how do you get some part of that. And that's a zero-sum game. You're going to have to knock somebody else out to get that share of wallet, if you will. And that's your competition. It's competition for the money, even if it's not the same solution as you have. It's the same point here. So there's a finite amount of dollars, time, people and attention that can pay homage to whatever it is that your idea is. So what you want to do is find something that is underserved, that's unmet, that for some reason hasn't been paid attention to before. And that's not easy. That's what makes for great entrepreneurs, is when they can see those unmet needs. Now, I'm going to invite Mike back here to talk a little bit about how this came up in the storage world.
So these are, again, original slides, Actifio 1.0 slides, or Actifio, as it was spelled. And the point of this slide is just that there were lots of technical innovations taking place in the storage industry. You had a move to what they called thin provisioning, which was essentially a higher level of granularity in the way data was stored. You had the advent of data deduplication, which is a reduction in some of the copies that data creates, at least at the end of the backup silo. Blah, blah, blah. Right? There were some technical changes that were happening in terms of the way that storage was managed. And in the face of these technical challenges, customers were responding with a need for a simpler approach. And what they wanted were these things that are called today appliances. They are essentially single-function storage devices. And over time, the confluence of these two things, new technologies enabling lots of new functions, and customers' affinity for simple devices that I could kind of plug and play into their networks, you ended up with this very complicated multi-tiered system. All these little appliances, all these little toasters and kitchen things and devices that did one thing very well, and individually they were easy to kind of deploy and put in place, but the result, if you look down on the architecture as a whole, was this sort of patchwork quilt of different solutions that really weren't designed to work together. So, applying the framework to where the company found itself in the early days, I think that we did a pretty good job against the 4 U's, right? In terms of our value proposition, there was really no way to solve this complexity problem with current technology, right? Current technology had evolved incrementally from the technology that preceded it, because that's in the interests of the status quo. Every enterprise with data to be accessed and protected had this problem, because they had all these little issues to be dealt with, so it was absolutely unavoidable. It was urgent because what happened over time as data moved from megabyte to terabyte to now petabyte scale, companies were finding that more and more of their IT budgets were being consumed by checks they had to write to EMC for more and more spinning disk to store their crap. It was like the enterprise equivalent of like those places where you store your stuff. Just imagine if you were paying more for that than you were for your rent. That's what was happening in the ID department. So there was great urgency to try and liberate resources from these more mundane storage capabilities and apply them against more strategic IT objectives. And then finally, the market was underserved, primarily because the big vendors all had a very concrete disincentive to tackle this problem in the way that served the customer. In the end, the big companies were just buying more and more of these little, these little application companies, these little organizations, and compiling them into these more and more complex iterative things, and with that complexity came the opportunity for services revenue, and everything was great. But this was the problem state as articulated by the company, and even though it's kind of hard to wrap your head around the problem, I think we did a pretty good job finding one.
That's a great example. Thank you, Mike. So I'll tell you what it was like as the VC on the other side. It became pretty obvious that we all know that storage is increasing. We could all see around us that people are starting to take more photographs, they're starting to use more video, they're starting to share more of that, and that this problem was ballooning. But more importantly in the enterprise, that this data was becoming actually a compliance issue. For example, people were being told they had to keep 7 years worth of data. And by the way, it wasn't just their documents. Now it was their email. No, it's their chat. No, it's actually any interaction with customers. So you can see all these reasons from a market standpoint that would cause people to have more and more data, and it was becoming more and more unworkable. And as Mike says, what's interesting about it is it was distracting from their core business, which is interacting with their customer, because they're having to do all this other stuff just to manage those interactions and store it all. And what's interesting about this is it's again an example of a problem that came about from vendors who looked at things in a very specific way and said, I'm going to solve this problem. But what was disruptive here was that the company started thinking about it in terms of an end-to-end storage problem. And that's what happened in the storage world. So this problem built up, and that's what made it underserved, is that vendors were reinforcing their one-off specific solutions as opposed to thinking about the end-to-end problem about how do you manage data. So that was the 4 U's for Actifio, and I encourage you, when you start to think about this, to break it down into some specific things that you can identify from the customer's viewpoint are their 4 U's. What's unworkable for them, what's unavoidable for them. I have my own way of expressing this for consumers. Consumers actually have a hierarchy of needs. This happens to be Maslow's hierarchy. So we'll test this with Facebook. What is the need that Facebook meets? You could say, guess what? It really wasn't a need. I mean, I didn't have a need. But then you start thinking about it. We all have the need to be social. We actually need, it's a fundamental part of our sort of human being to connect with people. It turns out that actually it's a very important need. It's so high up in our world that when we think about it, we want to find people, we want to connect with them, we want to communicate with them, we want to meet them, we want to share stuff with them. But guess what? We like to entertain each other, and we like to do basic things like date and get married. Guess what? That's a pretty big set of needs. So it's not surprising that Facebook has been an incredibly successful product and service. It's addressing some really significant needs. Now, they may not be about storage, but that's the point about these frameworks. I bet there's a way that when you stop and think about the individual needs that you're trying to address for your customer or your consumer, you can express them in these terms. This next framework I want to introduce to you, which is the thing black and white? And black and white's just an acronym again for spelling out this framework of, have you got a problem that's blatant and critical, or is it latent and aspirational? Well, let's talk about that. In Uber's case, I mean, we all know that we blatantly have a need to get from A to B, but did we know that we needed a service that would be callable on our iPhone from anywhere? I don't think so. I don't think drivers thought that that was something they needed, that they needed an app to tell them how to find consumers. But the minute that you uncover this, if you like, latent potential, and you show it to be so compelling in the way that Mike's talking about, people will say, well, why would I ever stand at a taxi rank anymore? That makes no sense. I can just pull out my app and just find a driver that's nearby and get the price I want, have them pick me up and take me where I want. And by the way, the receipt's all done and everything else for me. So what happens in a lot of marketplaces is you start with latent aspirational needs, and if you do a really good job, they become more and more part of your daily life and they become blatant critical needs. However, I will tell you, it's a lot easier if you could actually start with blatant critical needs, because those are the places right away where people will spend money. Now, if we could talk about storage again for a second, there's no way you can get out of the compliance in financial services we're talking about of storing data for 7 years. It's actually a requirement. It's just it's just a fundamental piece of doing business, and you get shut down if you don't do those things. You have regulators who come around. That's a blatant critical need. The white part of it is pretty obvious, which is, can you find a white space in the marketplace, an open area of opportunity which you can capture and defend and do so uniquely? So this is more about identifying the particular underserved space that we were talking about. But if you can find black and white opportunities, in other words, blatant and critical needs that have not been addressed, you're probably onto a really good opportunity. And that's really what this framework's about. So for Actifio, why don't you spell out how you define black and white?
Geometric data growth, unmet RTO, which is a recovery time objective. So you sign up for a service level agreement, or SLA, as the manager of one of these IT organizations, and you as a result, they say, well, if we go down, we only want to be down for 15 minutes. So your RTO is 15 minutes. And if you don't make your RTO, that is you have your perfect sales process, which is a guy who gets fired if it doesn't work. Petabyte scale big data, I've talked a little bit about that. All those things were blatant and critical. And what we needed to create was a connection to this idea that I'll explain in a little bit, called copy data, as the root cause of that problem. When we came up with the right way to explain that idea, what we found was that customers embraced it. And it was only when we came up with a better way to communicate, to tell our story, that the business really started to take off at the level that sort of defines it today. So we found that white space in the market, but it was white space that the market didn't know it had. We had to reframe the problem in a way that they could see it.
So you brought up a very important term there, which is sometimes you end up having to reframe the problem.
Yeah.
You have to get the consumer to see something you hadn't necessarily realized
Yeah,
before.
absolutely. I think it was the great Michael Skok who said, "A problem well understood is a problem half solved."
I wish it was, but it wasn't. But that is a great, for those of you who don't know it, really clearly defining a problem is so often the basis on which you can start to have a conversation that is accelerating your ability to actually solve it. But if you can't define it well, you're not in a position to obviously solve it. So yeah, well said.
Yeah, and having the opportunity to, many times, you can change the way people think about a problem. Now, it's not manipulation. Like, you need to reveal underlying truth to a customer, right? I think marketing gets a bad rap sometimes because people think it's sort of manipulative. And really, great marketing is revealing an underlying truth.
A latent need.
Yeah, a latent need.
So I think to summarize on the problem piece, as you heard right up front, we really believe that the best way for you to get started is not to just have a free-floating idea. It's to get very specific about what's unworkable, unavoidable, what's urgent, what's underserved about it, and how black and white is it. And if you can express it in terms that are very clearly for you with blatant and critical needs, and that's addressing a white space, I bet you're going to find you're in a place that you can start to build something significant. Now, what's nice about this is that your ideas can then be applied to that problem. You can sit down and you can brainstorm with a group of people and say, look, we're really clear what's not being met as a need here. We're really clear why it's urgent. We're really clear why it's unavoidable. So let's throw all the ideas at that and score them. You can rate them against which one of these is actually really going to hit the problem and make it, for example, more obvious as a priority, is going to solve it more significantly. And so when you fit ideas to a problem, I encourage you to find ways to do that scoring. And I would, at this point, say, all of what I've said sounds like it's academic, but you've actually got to get out and test this with customers. Everything I've said is irrelevant unless you get out of the building and start to validate it and spend time with the people who are actually going to try to use your product or service. At that point, there's a critical thing you've got to do. You've got to be incredibly honest with yourself about whether you're having to push or whether actually you're getting people to tell you what their needs are. If you're pushing your ideas, you've probably got a problem. If you're hearing people tell you their problems and go, oh yeah, I've got that problem, then you're probably onto something. And then if they start telling you, oh, I've not only that problem, but let me tell you about this other piece of it. So, I've not only got an autistic child, but I've actually got all these problems with the healthcare, for example, recompensation associated with that. And let me tell you about all the things that I need in the way of consulting for that. Then you get to probably have an interesting dialogue between the two of you that will draw out more of the problems, and then you can find out what are the unmet needs and things that you can address. So my acid test for you at this point is get out of the building, go test it with the customers, and find out whether they are actually starting to tell your story for you. If they're not, and if they're not buying into your problem and they're not literally starting to replay it for you, you probably need to go back and iterate on it. It's a tough piece of love that I'm giving you here. Because I'll tell you what most entrepreneurs tend to do. They tend to have so much enthusiasm for their idea and so much conviction around it that they're not listening, they're telling. And you need to be a good listener at this part. You need to be clear about that. Okay, the good news is we've done the define piece. And the next piece, I'm going to help you go down the evaluation piece. So a little bit of what I just said is good common sense, but I'm now going to try to get to some more specific examples of how you can evaluate the significance of your own idea. What I'd like to do here is to ask the obvious W questions. Who, what, when, where, why are all these solutions going to be useful to or for and when? And that's really the opportunity in your startup. But I'm going to immediately put a warning up here. And we talked a little bit about this last week, for those of you who are here. The worst set of vectors that I find startups going off to say they're solving are faster, better, cheaper vectors. So let's pause, and if you were here last week, feel free to jump in, but if you weren't, I'd love to hear from you. Why is faster, better, cheaper not a great starting point for a startup? Why is that not a great basis for a new solution?
Your competition can copy you or just drop their margins a little bit and compete with you. Faster, it's always better to be faster, as we talked about before, but building a whole company around faster, your competition could just be motivated to go faster.
Mm-hmm. I was fast as more in the product sense, so actually you're right. But let's just build on your thinking. I couldn't agree more. But there's a fundamental problem with this as a startup, which is you have always, by definition, less resources than everybody else as a startup. You're starting from zero. And so if you've got big competitors, they can afford to do exactly what you just said. They can afford to drop their margins to zero or their prices to zero and give stuff away in order to put you out of business. Or they'll have more resources to figure out what it is that you've got as a slightly marginal improvement to their product or service. And they'll just put their resources on that and go after making it better. I'm not saying that's always the case, because there are cases in point where faster, better, cheaper can be good, but it's not the ideal starting point. And in many instances, it's very easy for larger, better funded competitors to go after. But what's really exciting, though, that you can do as a startup is you have absolutely nothing to lose because you're starting from nothing. And so you can afford to break the rules. In fact, you can afford to take on the big lumbering giants precisely because they're big lumbering giants. And so I encourage you to break through with whatever thinking you're doing. And again, not just technology. So the moniker here is come up with 3 Ds, and the 3 Ds are discontinuous innovation, defensible technology, and disruptive business models. These also, by the way, are part of what I was answering in your question earlier. A discontinuous innovation is something that fundamentally changes the way you do things. So the obvious one that we've all grown up with is the internet. The internet fundamentally changed so many businesses. It effectively disintermediated any connections that were traditionally done manually by making them available continuously online all the time. And so that made it possible for us to think about pretty much every business in a different way, where it's goods and services that can be that can be served, for example, in a digital way. It's a fundamental disruption. Everything that can be digitized could be delivered over the web, whether we're talking about music or whether we're talking about wiring money. These are fundamental disruptions that the internet brought. So what's also, of course, typical is that we think about things in technology terms. Now, technology can be defensible too. It's fair to say that the first thing people tend to think about when they think of defensible technology is coming up with patents. That is one part of it, but patents actually bring their own sets of issues. And then the last D is the one that I was starting to get at here, which is disruptive business models. It turns out that this is worth a whole session, and so we do have a whole session in Startup Secrets on business models. Business models have become a huge part of what have effectively caused innovation. If you think about the world in which we live now, we take it for granted, for example, that we want to collaborate on things, that we want to share things. And that's given rise to business models as fundamentally changing as Lyft or Uber, but also Groupon, Airbnb, many other things like this. And they're very disruptive. They're hugely game-changing. The most obvious one in the software world, when I was, if you like, watching the evolution of our business, was Google coming along and attacking Microsoft. And Google basically said, you know what, we're not going to play the same rules as Microsoft in the apps game. We're actually going to give away apps for free, and we're going to monetize the data for advertising. Well, Microsoft had a $3.5 billion business called Office, and there's no way that they could play that game because they were employing engineers who were basically entirely devoted to creating high-value, deep apps that they were making a lot of money out of. So it wasn't a technology win. In fact, Google apps never caught up, to this day aren't as rich or as deep as Microsoft apps, but they're good enough and they're free, and Google monetizes them in a different way. So the disruption there was the business model more than the technology. And so I encourage you to think about this as one of the ways that you and your 3Ds can be disruptive. So now that Ash is here, I want to invite him up to come join us at the front and introduce himself. Come on up, Ash. So Ash is the founder that helped get Actifio from zero to the place it is today.
Which is back at zero, or?
Hopefully not. And love to have you talk, Ash, about, since we've got this now to this place, what was the opportunity you identified? And then let's have Mike talk about how it met the 3Ds. So we've talked a little bit about the background to storage and the challenges behind it. And you had a vision for this unified data services, and this was the slide that you were presenting in the sort of V1 of the story. Jump in and tell us a little bit about it and how you were thinking about these 3Ds.
Okay. So I think it's a very, very simple story. There's only one thing I know since my working life, and that's storage. And so I guess it's pretty natural for me to come back and address something that I've lived with for about 20, 25 years on different facets of the table. I was a typical young engineer. I went on to be a large company executive. I went on to be a VC for a while, did some startups, and all common theme throughout the whole thing was about the storage world. So when we look back as an investor looking at investment theme around one of those disruptive themes you're thinking about, there are a few things that stand out over the last, I would say, 5-10 years, and this is in 2008 now. We saw a big change in, I think some of the stuff you're talking about, big change in how IT is delivered. We saw a big change in how people use computing resources. And with the emergence of models like the SaaS models, this whole notion of how consumers consumed and the death of the box, basically. The whole idea of a box being something that you consumed, you bought, slowly became as old as the mainframe business. So we looked at those three big paradigms and found an opportunity to come back and create a disruptive environment where we decouple what you do with your data versus where you store it. The old model was there was a box, it came with a few knobs, and if you wanted more of those knobs, you found more boxes. And that's the way the business ran. And I think your Microsoft Office example is a perfect one. There was no shared model. There was no ability to separate out what I really paid for from a value perspective versus the junk that has to come with the value. And so that was the basis for how we came back and tried to come up with a model that separated out what is truly important for the business from what is truly a commodity and come up with this unified data management model. So I think that was the starting point for the discussion. And having been steeped in the industry for a long time, or some people call me probably jaded in the industry for a long time, I think the toughest part was to get out of our own shell and say, well, that's how I used to do it 15 years ago. Surely it must be working fine because we have companies that have 20, 40 billion dollar market caps building around this model. And that's probably the toughest part, is to get out of your own mold of what you knew and really look at the discontinuity from a position of strength rather than just a position of comfort.
Great. So Mike, do you want to highlight this in terms of the 3Ds that Actifio would claim they've taken?
Yeah, well, first I want to highlight the importance of this first one, right? Discontinuous innovation. It's one thing if you're coming to an industry you know nothing about, which was my huge advantage. It takes real courage to change something inside the sort of, the Gorbachev model. You're part of the system and then you decide to change it from within. Very difficult to do. So discontinuous innovation really starts with the courage to break with the past. And I talked earlier about some of the themes that Ash just reiterated, which was changes in the enabling technologies of storage and a customer affinity for these single function boxes and applications. And I think early in the company's life, Ash and David really made a decision that we're going to start with something totally new, start with a blank sheet of paper. The cliche is actually true in our case. That's what they started with. That led to the development of some defensible technology. So it started off with the architecture, a new way of solving the problem. We've invested a lot of time and other people's money in building up now a portfolio of 22 patents, in process, filed, or pending, in order to make this original idea real. Right? There was a whole bunch of enabling stuff that needed to happen for us to realize that original vision that happened on a yellow line piece of paper. And then what's come last was a way to sell that and price it in a way that is very difficult for our already public scaled competition to match. It would involve complex restatement of the way they do their financials and alter their cash flow model in a way that would make investors unhappy. So for us, I think it starts with that break. It starts with a better way, and I think after finding that, it's years of work to go and do everything necessary to realize the vision on that piece of paper.
Although to your credit, Ash, I would say that right away from day one, you were willing to think about all of these 3Ds. Like, for example, I remember having discussions with you about disrupting what were traditional big box salespeople by figuring out how to sell this as a service. Is that fair?
Right. I think, like I said, this is probably one of the most conservative markets. I mean, as much as we talk about disruption here, we had to be cognizant about how much friction there is between an idea and a business. And so there's a lot more in terms of the thought process of what else could we make discontinuous and disruptive. But we took a lot of baby steps, but you're absolutely right. Now, right from the beginning, we looked at the models of what worked in the consumer industry. By the way, this is another big phenomenon, I think, that drove what we did. For the first time in 10 years, maybe 15 years ago, was when the consumer markets truly started driving technology and consumption models. Never happened before. It was usual enterprise guys. We were the smartest guys around, but not anymore. And so we learned a lot. It truly allowed the elephants to start dancing. And this was one of those things that we learned a lot, kept trying to tune it at the speed at which the market could absorb.
Great. Good stuff. Thank you. We'll hear more on the story in a little while. Now, the next startup secret is such an obvious one, I put it up there, but I'm going to try to spell it out for you. It's actually so much work to start a company and to build a product and to take it to market and to get your business model working and all those other things, that why wouldn't you pick a market that's got great potential to be something really big? In other words, why pick a small fight when you can pick a big one? I'll tell you, it's just as much work in many instances to pick a small fight. You're still going to have to figure out how to hire great people and figure out how to solve your customers' needs. So why not find a market space that's really got huge potential where when you get it right, you can have a really big impact? And honestly, a lot of the times that we turn opportunities down as VCs, it's because they're frankly not big enough. They're not exciting enough. They're not, significant enough. And where there are big problems, there are big opportunities. And where there are big opportunities, it's probably worth spending the time and energy to build, a significant solution that you can get real value from. So for what it's worth, we always talk about these as game changers. What are the things that you can go after that change the game, that rewrite the rules, that cause a market to be disrupted, that ultimately result in huge value? That's what we're interested in. So in the evaluation of these things, I'm going to give you two frameworks. One is a qualitative one, and the second is a quantitative one. And the qualitative one is very easy. We want you to be able to tell your story in a before and after scenario. We want to be able to tell it in before there's some acute pain, something that if you don't solve it, as we talked about earlier, has consequences that are really significant. Consequences that can cause things to go wrong, people to get fired, money to get lost, etc. And then after, we want you to be able to say, but once you've got my product or service, look, all those problems go away, they vanish. And there's absolute joy here because now, the customers are being well served, we're making more money from them, and things are flowing more naturally. So this before and after thing is something that you've got to do a simple exercise on. You've got to decide whether what you're doing is solving a nice-to-have problem, which somebody could take a vitamin for, or a must-have problem where they need something fundamental like penicillin to address it, or surgery, or whatever it might be in your particular domain. And if you've got a nice-to-have problem, I'm not really that excited about that. If you've got a must-have problem, and you've absolutely got to have something that is literally a drug of penicillin strength or morphine or whatever it might be to solve that pain, then you've got an interesting solution. So let's use Actifio as an example again and bring up how did they think about the before and after scenario, and start to tell the second phase of the story, Mike, if you would.
So phase two of the startup journey is the point at which you've corrupted your vision with the external reality. Right? You've proven out your hypothesis in the real world because more than one person has paid you for it, and there's a pattern in those dots. And that's a very different stage of the organization. Here you have a strategy that is much more stable than in phase one. You have a product that is maturing or becoming, it's reached a critical mass of maturity in the way it's consumed. The customer is, we think of it as kind of the ultra early majority, right? There's the old crossing the chasm, and that's kind of where we are, is that we're on that front edge of just sort of clearing the Grand Canyon there. The engine is a combination of heroism and systems. I wish I could say it was all process and systems, but it's not. It's a difficult stage of the company where you still have to do all the hero shit, but in your spare time you have to build systems and processes to make that unnecessary. and it's a stressful time, costs you a lot of hair. That's part of that. And then the priority really is just to make sure you're making happy customers in the world. And I think that in our company, that is job one. Like whatever bumps and bruises we get along the way, because it's hard to make all this stuff work, we just want to make sure that we have happy customers, because that's really the foundation of the business going forward. All right, so who here feels like they have a pretty good handle on what Actifio does? Who here understands what Actifio does pretty well? Okay. All right.
How many were there?
One.
Can we talk to you?
All right. Great positioning tells a story. Okay? We all want a story. We don't want a slide. We want a story. And the way that we explain Actifio to people like yourselves today is with an analogy. So who here has a smartphone? All right, when you take a picture with that phone, you create a 1 meg file. Okay? If you're an Apple user, PhotoStream is going to do you the kindness of sending that to your iPad and your laptop. And so now your 1 meg file is consuming 3 megs of storage across devices and in the cloud. If you send that to Instagram and it bounces out to your Twitter and Facebook accounts, your 1 meg photo is now consuming 6 megs of storage across those multiple devices. Okay? Now, the exact same thing happens in the enterprise. You have all those systems that Ash described in those initial slides, and they're all making copy after copy of what's in production without knowing what copies already exist. Backup makes a copy, snapshot, disaster recovery, all these different systems. The big difference with my analogy is that instead of a 1 meg photo, this might be a 10 terabyte Oracle database. And it's now consuming 60 terabytes of data across the enterprise. Around the world, this is a $44 billion problem. It represents 60% of the money that customers spend on disk capacity, drives 65% of their storage software spending, and accounts for 85%, the vast majority of their hardware. Businesses are spending much more to manage copies of their data than they are to manage their data, and we think this is crazy. Who understands what Actifio does now? Okay, that is marketing.
Is there somebody who doesn't understand?
I don't know. We'll talk. There was an MIT guy in the back. He still doesn't. It was a joke. All right, so I'm going to show you the way that we tell that story at the next level of detail. These are like 2 or 3 slides from what we call our CXO deck. And what's interesting is like going through these with Michael, I'll be able to reinforce a lot of the ideas that we've shared. So, our pitch really starts with this image and the observation that every business out there is dealing with an explosion in the amount of data that they need to manage. That is the problem. That is the problem the guy sitting in front of you has, is he's got a growth curve of his data that looks like this. And so what we help him understand is that the majority of that data is not production data. It's not data being produced by the systems that they use to run the business. It's data that is being produced by systems that make a copy of that data, right? And I mentioned these metrics, right? 44 billion, 60%, 65, and 85. Now, the root cause of this is these siloed systems. In the beginning, there was backup, and backup was good, right? You got to back your stuff up. Backup wasn't fast enough at some point, though, and so people created separate systems to make snapshots of their production data. Separate systems copying the same data. People wanted to take those snapshots and put them someplace else in case there was a smoking hole at headquarters, and the disaster recovery market was born. People had a disaster. They couldn't get it back fast enough. They needed it faster. That's business continuity, separate systems. We have to make copies of data support application development. That's test and dev. And we need more copies to run our archives and do our analytics on. All right, so that's just the physical layer. There's this whole virtual layer of technology as well, and that results in massive excess duplication, huge spending on infrastructure, all this operational complexity, and massive cost to make it all work together. All right, so this is just a simplified version of many of the themes that were in that original deck, but now brought to light in the context of a story that human beings can wrap their head around. So what Actifio did, the sort of innovation, was to start with a blank sheet of paper and say, look, you have your production data over here, and we're not going to touch that. What we're going to do is we're going to manage copy data, and we're going to do that by doing a full ingest of everything in your production environment. Not a point solution that adds to everything you have. We're going to take a single copy of everything. And from that point forward, after that first ingest, we're only going to store and move a unique deduped version of whatever we don't have. Right? So I'm only capturing the changes after that initial snapshot. And I'm going to store that in such a way that I can spin up a virtual copy for any of those uses that you now manage separately. And that's it. And the beauty of this is once you architect the system that way, you get to manage it all with a single application. Okay? Actifio is radically simple copy data storage. That's what it is. Radically simple copy data storage. You know, one of my favorite quotes is from this guy. He said, if you can't explain it simply, it's because you don't understand it well enough. And I think that there's great truth in that. There is a sort of, you know, art and some craft in terms of the ability to turn that into something that that resonates with you know, you aren't people who understand the problem, so it's even more acute for you. But I really believe this, and my, you know, thing for you to take away is I see entrepreneurs and they're afraid to tell it simply, to just say, what is it? Like when I'm working with an entrepreneur, I'll say, just tell me what it is. Like they'll talk for 5 minutes about an acute, robust platform for the, and I'm just like, I saw your mouth moving, I have no idea what you do. And it's because we all have this professional persona, and we feel like if it's complicated, it's legitimate and it's substantive. Make it simple. Have the courage to make it simple, boil it down to something a 12-year-old can understand. I promise it will accelerate the growth of your business.
So what's exciting about, thank you, Mike, what you just heard is, you were all sitting there, and by the way, this was the risk that Mike and I agreed we'd take, is that you wouldn't understand what the hell Actifio did until he did his reveal. But that's a lot of the point of what this is about, which is, if you just explain all the technology and all these other issues, and you don't get it to a place where people can really experience, wow, that's absolutely ridiculous. Why would I store my photograph, you know, multiple times, and why would I waste all that space? Oh, and in the enterprise, it's, you know, orders of magnitude bigger, and why would you do that? Then you don't get people to a place where they understand that before scenario, all this pain that makes no sense. And you don't get them to a place where they're looking for a solution. And when you tell them the story, you go, well, that's a relief. Thank goodness somebody took care of that for me. So no better person than to share the before and after scenario that you had in mind than Ash himself. So Ash, come tell us a little bit about how you saw this and how you describe the sort of the afterworld now that Actifio actually has solved this.
Well, the afterworld is incredibly beautiful. But it's a nirvana. We're wondering why we don't have 44 billion in revenue yet, but we're getting there. Like I said, I think career-wise, you've looked at storage companies that have just done an incredible business of piling on more storage to save all kinds of data. I used to run HP's storage business about 6 years, 7 years ago, $6 billion business. And there was a very interesting scenario where 50 of the biggest HP's customers used to be brought in for an off-site retreat. And I had my counterpart who ran the software business, my counterpart who ran the server business. I was a storage guy. And the CIOs would come, people who ran big businesses, would come in and ask the software guy, hey, I need some innovation in security. What's your roadmap for the next 5 years? I'm trying to build this web business. The server guy would be about, hey, density, processing power. And when it came to the storage guy, it used to be a very simple question. I don't know what you guys do. All I know is my guys are just asking me for more and more budget every quarter. Can you just make this thing free? Because I really can't see the value of this thing. All I know is there's tons of storage being consumed. And that was the starting point. The before story was a very simple exponential growth that just showed that $29 billion of storage in 2013 was bought to store copies of data. 29 billion. In fact, if you look at the numbers, the storage market on the production side is literally half that. And so the ability to take that geometric data growth and come back to doing something meaningful to say my spend on storage is now much better aligned with how my business grows. I have no problem paying for something that I build up my business on. I have a problem when it's non-linear. And that's the part that we first come back and talk about. In fact, it becomes less than linear in many cases. The ability to reuse the same data for many things allows you to reuse a lot of the same storage for many, many different purposes. So that's the number one. And that solves the problem that I was asked by the CIO group maybe 8 years ago. So it took me a little while. I'm a little slow, but it took me a little while to come back and address that geometric data growth. Next part, I think there's this whole concept. I mean, how all of you probably dealt with having to pay the health insurance premium or premium for all kinds of auto insurance, and the only goal there is it keeps piling on. In fact, that's the whole notion of the insurance business. It keeps piling on until you have the rainy day that you need this fund for. Now imagine if this insurance actually could work for you, that paid for the school, that paid for taking care of your car, and be able to become an asset, not just something that you pay hoping the day that it's to be used does not come, or maybe does come. But that's the ability for what we have taken as a liability, as an insurance, as something that is more of a risk that you have to pay for and hope I never have to use, to something that becomes an asset. Hey, I have my backup data. Can I use it to accelerate my SaaS business? We today have a SaaS company that literally speeds up their development platform, the release of development by 8 times. And imagine if you're a business and I could speed your business by 8x and charge you nothing more than what you did before. That's a hell of a way to convert what used to be an insurance into an asset.
Are you speeding time to market for them, literally?
Time for
New
all
innovation?
the updates and so especially for a SaaS company.
Yeah, that's a big
That is
deal.
absolutely what happens. You take something being done in 13 weeks down to a few minutes, which brings up the next one. I mean, who the heck wants to wait for hours when I want some information? Now, if I want a file, I just lost my file, and the old model, this sounds pretty crazy to people who haven't worked in the enterprise, but the model was you call the IT guy, ask for some file, and somewhere about 2 weeks later, you get your database or file back. Unheard of. Those in the consumer industry want it now. So does the enterprise too, because businesses don't have the time to wait for days and weeks to get the information back. And that ability for us to come back and demonstrate access to information anytime, anywhere, instantly was a huge difference. In fact, if anything, if you come back and say, hey, I give away my competition, if I look at the competition, these are big, massive companies. They could give away the product for free. The reason I'm late here is, we were in the middle of a deal. Our fiscal quarter ends end of this month. We are competing against a competition that's bid $34 million against us, and we probably end up at about $1.5 million, 30 times less. They could give it away. They're big enough. What they cannot do is beat the one part of what it really means to run a business, which is the speed, time. This is the one dimension that seems to go only in one direction. And that ability to come back and change the speed at which you access information anywhere, that is probably what Mike would call the killer value proposition. You can literally give away my competition's product. What you cannot do is to come back and make my information available fast enough, because you cannot give back time.
So Ash, just to pause on that
Sure.
very clearly spells out something we were talking about earlier, which is it's making it obvious that even a company as large as, and I don't know whether it was EMC, but whoever is a big company that's your competitor, can give their product away, but they can't do what we do here. And when that happens, the better, faster, cheaper is not even in question.
Absolutely. And I think, most innovations, and this is some slide we talk about when we talk at our presentation, most innovations are exactly that. Hey, I do about the same thing, but I'm 10x cheaper. Or I'm about the same price, but I'm 10x faster. This is one of those things, once every so often happens, where it's literally on both those dimensions. You are 10x to 20x cheaper, and boy, you're 100x faster than ever before. That causes a complete disruption in the market, and that's what we've done. I think for those who follow the server side, there's some company called VMware that's done that, and my counterpart used to run the HP server business. The poor guy just lost. I mean, you thought you lost your hair? Oh man, he's completely gone. But decimated the market. So that's what happens when software completely takes over what used to be packaged hardware. And the last part, we talked about this this prison of boxes that the vendors used to come back and deliver. I used to sell you a box, and by the way, if you want more of this, you better buy from me, because this box doesn't talk to anybody else. You have to buy more of my stuff and more of my stuff until you get to a point where you're so fed up that you decide to take the big shift. This ability to come back and change that and provide freedom. I think Mike used to have this phenomenal slide a long time ago. Look, we are dramatically faster, we're dramatically cheaper. And they had this slide of a guy on top of a hill saying, and by the way, you're free. You're free from what used to be a prison of vendor dependency. I think all of these, they're hard to think about, and usually try to get it down to one or two things, maybe three things. But I think it's important for paradigm shifting technologies to demonstrate this much bigger things that happen than just one or two things.
Great, thank you, Ash. So you can hear as Ash has just told this story, it's like this, before paradox of all these problems where people were spending money they didn't need to and weren't getting any value out of it. And after, not only are they having their problems solved, but there's a whole bunch of benefits that are absolutely empowering, that enable things like products being built faster, innovation being delivered quicker, information being returned sooner, empowering people, making things possible. That's what I'm talking about between before and afters. If you can tell your story in that way, that is the qualitative version of what I think you should evaluate your value proposition around. So now we're going to move on to the quantitative piece. This actually, in some ways, is easier because it's about defining in sort of a more specific framework what is the gain that you deliver to your customer, and then what is the pain it takes them to adopt it. Now, most people only spend time as entrepreneurs on the gain piece, and I'm here to tell you that the pain piece is more important when you start. So let's talk you through that. The gain is usually your set of benefits. The pain is the cost for the customer to adopt it. And if we go through these, you're bound to have, and you better have, a whole bunch of great gains. You save people money, or you make them more money. You help them, for example, find customers faster, or you reduce their time to market, or you save, for example, the number of people involved, or somehow you give them competitive advantage, which in many instances for early adopters is actually key. So you're giving them some capability they never had before. And then ultimately, you net that all out and you decide, as Ash said, on what might be the top 3 things that you have as your unique selling points. So however you look at it, that's going to be the story that I hope every one of you as entrepreneurs could tell. But here's where it gets more interesting. Do you think it's easy for you to get found as a startup? No, it's not. It actually is difficult to find startups. You don't have the budget to go advertise and have a brand the size of Coke. So guess what? There's a cost to find you even. There are other costs that start to come into play. How much does it cost for somebody to try your solution? Are you really, really easy for somebody to just download and use? Maybe you are if you're a simple little app. But if you're a complex piece of enterprise software, I doubt that it's incredibly easy for you to try. And I'm going to embarrass us for a second because I was there in the first board meeting. What was our challenge initially, Ash, with Actifio? How many sort of bits and pieces because we weren't selling hardware originally. Do you want to tell that story a little bit? We had some real pain associated with getting our products adopted and tried by customers.
Right. I think as with every learning process, one of the things that Mike was talking about is a friction of just trying out. Here we are, complex enterprise software, trying to make life easy, and you're trying to make it as easy for yourself as much as you really focus on yourself first before you even worry about the users, because you don't know what the users are. We have this enterprise software. You're supposed to download it. You're supposed to buy a specific server of the right kind. We gave you the right server specs. You buy it. So we would start off the process. You were supposed to download it. Our guy is supposed to come and help you. 2 weeks later, our guy shows up. They still don't have the server. Or they did have it. They bought some cheap one with some memory that was bad. Next thing you know, what started out was supposed to be a 2-week effort. 3.5 months into it, we're still trying to putz around, figuring out why this thing is not up yet. Because our stuff worked fine in the lab. It's the rest of the environmental stuff that you have opened up as variables for the user to come back and actually make it work. I mean, you're basically asking the user, you be the integrator. I'll give you all the parts and pieces. Here's the menu. You cook the dish. I think that was a bad lesson because we wasted literally 3.5 months as opposed to giving them the entire dish and making it very easy to consume. That was probably the next part of what it took. I mean, today we do a pilot in 1 day. You walk in, We've taken an appliance. We did nothing more than what the user was doing, except we packaged it nicely. We have a nice little orange bezel that Mike came up with, Actifio orange as he calls it. And you plug it in, one day you're out of there, versus 3.5 months that it took us for the first time to get going. Huge difference.
Thanks. And having witnessed this, Actifio is not unique. Almost every startup fails to take the time to think about what is the customer experience going to be of trying your product or service, of evaluating it. Never mind buying it, just trying it. And it was fascinating to see how in Actifio's case, we came around to the point where eventually it's like, wait a second, why do we have the customer do any of this? Let's just integrate the whole thing, create the appliance. We had long discussions at the board meeting about, well, we don't want to be a hardware company, but wait a second, why don't we want to be a hardware company? That's just a mirage in our head. Aren't we a company that is delivering a solution in the end? That's what really counts. And Ash is nodding here, but these are the things that if you can just think about them up front, and again, put yourself in the customer perspective, can take a lot of the friction, the pain, et cetera, involved in this. And in the end, what you want to be able to do is evaluate this all the way down to the end and have the conversation with the customer and say, okay, it took you 3.5 months and it cost you how much and how many people are involved. And once you understand that extremely well, how could we take it to as close to zero as possible? If you can do that, you're in the right mode to be able to develop your gain-pain ratio. Now, it turns out there's something in between. And this is a piece that most people don't spend enough time on, so I'm just going to spell it out. As a startup, what do you think the biggest issue of doing business with you is? Anybody? It's on the slide, but I'm just interested. Go ahead.
And I come from mental health. Getting people to change their habits. People love their rituals and their routines and are committed to whatever they're doing. It's just like if I get you in the habit of sales saying yes, it's easier to say yes. If I get you in the habit of saying no, it's easier to say no, changing people's habits.
Well said. It turns out so many times the default is to do nothing. People are already used to a business process, or they're used to a particular product, or they're used to a particular procedure. And changing it takes energy, whether you like it or not. It's an inertia you've got to overcome. Now, what's the next thing that comes out of this? It turns out you are probably being considered as an alternative to something else, even if it's a manual alternative. And so what's the problem with being a startup? The problem is you are a risk as an alternative because you're an unknown. You don't have a brand. So whether you like it or not, you've got to assess this. You've got to say, okay, why would somebody do this? Why would they change their procedure, or why would they train people to do things differently? And there's got to be a really good answer to that. And in fact, that's why I give this a ratio. And what's the right ratio? Anybody tell me? How much bigger is your gain got to be than your pain to overcome that inertia? So let me bring Ash and Mike into play for a second again. What was our, if we thought we could make a gain-pain ratio of 2 to 1, would we thought we had a basis to start the business? No. Why not?
Well, I think it's a pretty obvious, all the stuff that you talked about in terms of the pain part or the inertia part, just the inability for me to, as a buyer, and by the way, that is the other role I used to play, which helped me
Let's actually have you stand up.
get through this process of being a buyer. I used to be one of the largest storage buyers too. And the inability for me to justify 50% better, big deal. I'm better off staying with my existing guy because it just doesn't make a difference enough for me, because the risk of something going wrong is significantly more than just a 50% better pricing or 50% better improvement of performance. So clearly, I'm not even in the ballpark at that point.
So it turns out the number is something like an order of magnitude. I mean, to state the obvious, overcoming risk and going through all the pain has got to have such a big impact that somebody says, I'm going to get off my ass and do it. and as a startup, you're overcoming that every time you walk through the door and pitch. And so you better be thinking about how you can express your gain-pain ratio in a fundamentally impactful way, which is, it's not literally got to be 10 to 1, but it's got to be an order of magnitude in terms of what you can say to somebody is the net benefit of what your solution is that you're delivering. What now? Our solution at Actifio, how would you say? Is it 10 to 1? Is it 100 to 1? How do we express our order of magnitude?
On an average, we're 30 to 1. We just, like I said, I just came back from this where we're 34 million versus 1.2. Recovery is 8.5 hours versus 2 minutes. Just a whole different ball game. I mean, you're
Okay. So now you hear that. I mean, hours versus minutes. Millions versus a million. That's where it gets to be impactful. And that's why Actifio is growing at the pace they are, because they've got that kind of value proposition. And if you don't have it, I'm not saying you don't have a business. I'm saying you're going to run into all this friction. You're going to have all these challenges. You're going to have this inertia to get over. So try to find, and that's why I also spend all the time up front saying, spend the time on finding whether you've really got something that's discontinuous, disruptive, and defensible. Because if you do, and it's really making an impact, it'll probably end up being at least a 10-to-1 gain-pain ratio. So, Mike, do you want to just quickly cover this since it's your sales pitch opportunity here now?
Any buyers? Anybody got a copy data storage? But no. So this is the slide we use to articulate gain to the customer, and we do it on the hard dollar side in the slide. And we're eliminating a whole bunch of software licenses and hardware. You can read the slide. We talk about 10x just on the cost side. So we get the first 10x there without quantifying the value of how much is it worth? What's an hour of downtime cost you? That question comes up when we produce our TCO ROI analysis. But we start the conversation really just on the basis of a 90% reduction in TCO. And we can quantify this for the customer after they tell us a little bit more about the money that they're spending today. Our strategy to minimize the pain side of the equation, recognizing that this wasn't enough, was to create a whole new class of storage. I would look for Ash's commentary on this slide. One of the other brilliant things they did is they said, we don't want to be in a pissing match for the stuff that you're already doing. The beauty of the copy data idea is it creates something different. We say, look, that's your production data. You just spent $4 million on a Commvault-based solution. Good for you. Great product. That's production data. What we do is copy data. And that's something different, something new. So it enabled us to reduce the perceived pain, the perceived switching costs on the part of the user. And the beauty of this was that it turned out that copy data was an even better market. As we kind of got behind this idea, we used IDC to go out and measure the size of these two markets. And they said, production data is about a $10 billion business. Copy data is about a $44 billion business. And by the way, the copy data, because it grows geometrically, that's the downside for the customer. The upside for the business is that's growing at a compound annual growth rate of 23% per year worldwide. So, this is really, I think, another one of the things that the company got right at the beginning was to reduce the perceived pain, create a totally new category that let them keep what they have in the production side of their business.
So if you're not already, getting the sense of this, Actifio has quantified their gain pain, and they've been very specific in terms of how they can deliver it to customers. And just to recap on this so you all have a sense of it, what I'm encouraging you to do is list out all of the things that you'll gain, of course, but spend time really figuring out what's the challenge that your customers are going to have when they try to adopt, use, deploy, manage, etc., your solution. And then in between, don't forget that you're a startup and that they're always going to look at you as a risk, and that, as we had so clearly identified from the audience, the default is to do nothing and just stick with whatever they're doing. My ultimate startups have the following secret. They are highly disruptive as innovations, but they're non-disruptive in their adoption. So they have all the impact in terms of the potential, but they don't require you to change anything, and that would be the ideal. Now, very few companies have that, but Ash mentioned one of them, and so I'll just bring it up. VMware is a good example. For those of you who don't know what they do, they virtualize compute environments. And in the server world, when you're running big data centers that support all the things that we use on our phones, et cetera, as cloud services, these servers used to have, on average, about, well, let's call it in the teens of utilization, so 15, 16, 18% utilization. That's crazy. You spend all this money to buy these big boxes, and they couldn't run at more than 18% utilization. What VMware did was to allow you to run multiple compute loads through virtualization on the same server. And they took utilization up by, guess what, some multiple, so that you got utilization up into the 80s or 90%, whatever you basically decided, usually into the 80s. And yet they did it by just taking existing compute loads, and you didn't have to change them. You didn't have to rewrite your application. You didn't have to rewrite your whole system that was being delivered. You just packaged them effectively in this virtualized container and ran them alongside each other. So it was a fundamental innovation, but it was non-disruptive to deploy it. People didn't have to rewrite. And that was why it was so successful. And it's true when you look back at the sort of big innovations that really take off, they don't require us to reinvent our business processes or relearn things. In Actifio's case, do you want to just, one of you tell the story of how this played out?
Now a storage guy.
So, yeah, very quickly, I mean, all the players each have a suite of capabilities, like a stack of things that you have to connect to do what we do alone. So we disrupted not only all the things that they do today, but there were a whole bunch of supporting technologies that came about to mitigate the downside of a flawed 20th century architecture, and we replaced those too. So, this disruptive, comes back to the disruptive business model idea. We took a lot of those functions that people were familiar with and that people think of as separate things, and we showed them how we could do those very same things with a single application.
Great. So what's great about this is if you look at the gain pain and you can evaluate it in the way that I just described, you will probably be able to very quickly determine whether you've got something that's worthwhile investing in the next stage of your business, which is how you take it to market. And that starts with building your value proposition in the way that I said right at the beginning. You're going to want to be able to express your value proposition in terms of for whom you are solving a problem uniquely well. And the framework, since it's up on the website, I'm not going to go through in detail, is about, first of all, picking your target customers. So that's got to be as narrowly defined as possible. And when we get in the go-to-market session later in the semester, we'll cover that. You spell out what they're dissatisfied with, what's wrong with the current problem, and the current solutions. And that's all about the problems we just went through. You spell out what your product does, and you just heard Actifio talk about, if you can, coming up with a new way to define it. So they talked about copy data. And then you spell out what's the specific thing that you're doing that is unique. And again, Actifio's case, it was actually unifying the data. And that unlike the traditional alternatives in Actifio's case, it was all the siloed products. This is a single means to manage all of that, which saves you a tremendous amount of money. So why don't we have you guys actually tell your story of how you came to the copy data concept and your positioning statement.
So, the copy data concept really, it does all this for us. It really works hard for us. It connects to a blatant customer problem. It establishes this customer priority because it's driving an explosion in storage that's consuming all their resources. It explains the gain in such a way that it's so huge, it actually engenders some cynicism on the part of customers who say, come on, you can't really do that. The sales process is a process of convincing them we told them the truth in the marketing process. And then we're minimizing pain by leaving their production data alone. So just a recap of how we're putting together some of those concepts that Michael's been talking about. So I talked a little bit about stories and their importance, and great stories have a structure, and the structure we use very much parallels the one that we just took a look at. We think in terms of 5 components of really positioning. Target, which is who is the actionable universe of buyers that we're talking to. Segment, which is if I had a room full of those people in the target, what qualifying question would I ask to figure out who's likely to be a customer and who's not? That's the segment. Brand is whatever you call yourself. Category is a competitive frame for the buyer, which is a very useful thing. It's very helpful if the buyer, people say, I say, who do you compete with very often to a startup, and they say no one. And I say, well, shit, that means you're going to need to train people about the problem that you solve. You want to try to create some category that the buyer understands. Distinction is what makes you unique in that competitive set. Proof is perceived evidence of truth to your claim of distinction. So this is a framework that sort of roughly parallels the one that Michael articulated. It is the one that we actually used. And when you string these together, you can articulate any company's value prop in a segment, in a paragraph that looks like this. For target who are segment, brand provides the category with distinction because of proof. And I can do this for almost any company. Yes, sir.
A lot of startups have to pivot early on, And early in your prezo, you talked about Actifio versus Actifio,
Yeah,
which could be just a pronunciation clearly. But
sure.
did you have to pivot? Why? And like what caused you to pivot? And was it a customer case, which I'm sure it was if you did have to pivot? But could you maybe go through a little bit of that? Because I think that would be very helpful for anyone
Yeah.
considering a startup.
I'm going to let Ash answer that. I will start by saying I hate that word. It's such a glossing over of an incredibly painful and soul-searching process for an entrepreneur to decide what aspects of their original idea to abandon and move on from. But with that said, I'd love to get your answer.
Yeah, I think the pivot wasn't about the basic concept. The Actifio versus Actifio was probably just a simpler way to explain how to say something that was having a hard time for the audience. But that apart, the quote-unquote pivot was also not in the product itself. If you look at and I can go back to 2008 set of slides that basically says, hey, look, people spend a ton more money on making and managing copies of data. What we did change was something that Michael was pointing out to. It's the ability to reduce the friction between what we're building and what the value proposition for the customer is, and what it took to demonstrate this very, very quickly. We talked about this copy data storage. And somebody really asks us, are you really a storage guys? I said, really? We're enterprise software. But really package it to look like a storage system because it's a paradigm that all the enterprise guys understand. It's a paradigm that's very easy to haul in, connect power, connect network, and boom, you're done in a day. So that part we constantly pivot. And there's more. And by the way, we're not done. We have a long way to go and I think we talked about this. Much of your innovation in packaging, messaging, value proposition continues to change. And I think that's one thing that definitely needs to change as we understand better, and more importantly, as a market understands us better. We couldn't have said we are copy data storage 3 years ago. They would have said, what the heck is copy data? Then Mike came in, defined the whole space called copy data. Now there are analysts. There are external proof that talk about, guys, we should all be managing copy data. It's not us. It's actually analysts talking about that. So there's a bunch of pivoting that we did in terms of packaging, in terms of better messaging, but not the fundamental product itself. The enterprise guys are a little tough to pivot. Consumer markets are a little different story. There's a lot of deep-rooted market analysis we do before we jump into this game.
So this was it. For enterprises managing lots of production data, Actifio Copy Data Management provides access to anything instantly because it's radically simple. And that was it. Everything that we've done is really based on that articulation in those buckets, and it's been a guidepost for everything that's followed. It was very gratifying to hear Gartner say that, but it was a year and a half of hard work, starting with a simple story and then focusing on quality of execution.
Thank you very much. So, it's taken a while to get us to the point where Actifio could just package all of that, but I often get asked by entrepreneurs, why is this so important? Why is it important to be able to end up with a statement like this? Well, how many times are you dealing with a pitch that you've got about 10 to 15 seconds to tell somebody what you do? All the time. And every time you get up to explain, whether it's in an elevator or a pitch competition, what you do, the more crisply you can state it in a value proposition like this, the more likely you are to get the hook in that begins the process of you being able to attract a customer and build a business. And that's why the value proposition is so important. When it's waffly, when it's not clear, when it's not obvious, when the benefits of the gain pain don't come through, then you've lost your opportunity. So it's very, very, very fundamental. And thank you to the Actifio guys for bringing it to this simplicity. What I love about this at the end of the day is that at the earliest stages, it can be built around you. So if you've got nothing else other than a value proposition to start off with, other than that you understand a problem uniquely well, that's a great starting point. So when I mentioned it last week, I literally said, the first thing I look for in an entrepreneur is what is their background that uniquely qualifies them to solve the problem they're talking about. And if, for example, you grew up, just to use the example we've been talking about earlier this evening, in the healthcare system, you worked your way through it, and you've spent years in it, and you've learned what all the problems are with it, and you've experienced exactly what pain goes on there, and you can then talk about that with absolute clarity, then you're probably in a perfect position to bring forth a new solution to address that problem. So the first thing in your value proposition that I encourage you to articulate is why you are uniquely able to see this problem. And then, of course, start to talk about what solution you personally have the skills or experience to start to deliver on. And finally, what is it that you think, in terms of some disruptive business model or experience that you've got around how this might be delivered, taken to market, and so forth, you could bring to it. But the point about this is, as an entrepreneur, the very, very first thing you can do is define yourself uniquely. And there's no reason why any of you in this room can't do that. And it's a great basis on which to start thinking about how do you build your value proposition. I could have put it first, but if you didn't understand what a value proposition was, it wouldn't have made sense. I'm just going to pause so we wrap up on time. The summary I want to bring into focus here is not that this framework is right. It's not that this is the only framework to use to define a value proposition. It's that it hopefully brings out for you that it's important to step back and think about, instead of just an idea, some great compelling technology you've uncovered or some great thought you've had, what problem does it solve uniquely well for who? Why is it unworkable? Why is it unavoidable? Why is it something that just is not being done today? And how could it become discontinuously innovative or defensible? And how could you literally deliver it in a way that gave your customers just absolute joy and some order of magnitude benefit that was easy for them to experience? If you can do that and you're an entrepreneur who's uniquely suited to solving that problem, you're off to a great start. So thank you very much. And a particular thank you to my guests, Actifio, Mike, and Ash. Great to hear your story. We really appreciate it.